Light tanks mostly died out in the early decades of the Cold War. They filled too niche of a role for militaries to keep them around. A new type of vehicle that emerged was the infantry fighting vehicle. These had some of the capabilities of a tank, but in a much lighter package. The Soviets first built their BMP, then the US copied the Soviet Union. This resulted in the M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, which has filled the role of light armor for the US Army since it was first put into service in 1981. It is designed for reconnaissance and personnel transport while also having the capability to accompany heavy armor such as the Abrams. Bradley fighting vehicles saw tremendous success in the First Gulf War. However, they were still vulnerable in certain areas. Also, a quick note that I will be referring to the Bradley as the M2 for simplicity's sake, but the latest variants are actually called the M2A2 and M2A3. In our present time, the M2 Bradley is fighting for Ukraine against Russia. Russia has known about the M2 Bradley for a long time, so they have likely developed strategies to counter it. Ukraine has received over 100 M2 Bradley vehicles, but they have also lost at least 34 of them. The Bradley fills a specific role in the Ukrainian military, but it may not be enough. It may lack the firepower that Ukraine currently needs. One of the key features of the M2 Bradley is its 25mm cannon. In some variants of the tank, the gun can fire automatically. For heavily armored targets, the fighting vehicle also has a tow missile launcher that can hit targets 3 kilometers away. This gives it a decent variance in its capabilities. As for armor, the aluminum armor of the Bradley is questionable at first glance, but before the war in Ukraine, the armor has proved itself as a protection for the crew. The vehicle may be wrecked, but the crew can bail out. Finally, the M2 Bradley is powered by a 600 horsepower engine that can propel it to up to 40 miles per hour. This gives it substantial maneuverability that is valuable on the battlefield. In its combat deployments, the M2 Bradley has performed quite well. In the First Gulf War, the IFVs were reported to have destroyed more Iraqi armor than the M1 Abrams did. In the entire conflict, only 20 Bradleys were lost, and most of these to friendly fire. Due to their high kill-to-loss ratio, the Bradleys had a large role in the Western victory in Iraq. The M2s did not perform nearly as well in the Second Iraq War, with upwards of 150 vehicles having been destroyed by the end of the conflict. Prior to the Ukraine War, the Iraq Wars were the major combat deployments that Bradley participated in. The Ukraine conflict has presented unique challenges, however. For one, the Iraq Wars were fought in mostly a desert environment, but Ukraine's landscape can be muddy, icy, cold, and wet. In terms of urban versus rural setting, there is likely not much of a difference between Iraq and Ukraine. The main difference would be the terrain that the Bradley is driving on. The threats that the M2 Bradleys face in Ukraine, however, are highly different compared to those faced in, say, Iraq. While Iraq had one of the largest armies in the world at the time, their army was fairly outdated, and their main advantage was their large number of infantry and armored divisions. Russia is a legitimate threat, even if they executed their invasion poorly. Anti-tank technologies have also rapidly progressed even in the last 15 years. Active protection systems have sprung up to counter new anti-tank missiles, but the M2 Bradley currently lacks an active protective system, which leaves it relatively vulnerable. In terms of outright physical protection, the M2 Bradley is lacking. To be fair, it is a light tank, but compared to the M1A1 Abrams in Ukraine, its armor is weak. Also, as Russian state media was quick to point out, the first M1 Abrams was recently destroyed in Ukraine. If the Abrams can be destroyed by Russian munitions, then the Bradley can be as well. As I already stated, 34 Bradleys have been destroyed by the Russian military, so there are some weaknesses that are being exploited at a decently successful rate. Against current threats, the Bradley can hold its own, but its ability to survive is situational. For example, last month 2 M2 Bradleys claimed to destroy a T-90M, one of the best Russian tanks. Still, it is not as if the M2s are regularly doing this, and about a third of the American-made IFVs have been lost already. Thus, the Ukrainian Bradleys are in a situation where they can take out targets, but they must be careful because they are still relatively vulnerable. In this way, the M2 can be thought of as a glass cannon. In terms of protection for the crew, the M2 Bradley is designed to save the crew and not the tank if it suffers catastrophic damage. The Bradley fighting vehicle can survive 30mm sabot rounds if it has reactive armor equipped. The main thing the M2 protects its occupants from is small arms fire and artillery fire. As for the crew themselves, the Ukrainian crews underwent a 5-week training program about a year ago in Germany. That may sound like a long time, but it is almost guaranteed that Americans training in the same vehicles spend much more time to become proficient in them. Thus, the crew's pre-battlefield training was likely lackluster. By this point, however, the Ukrainian crews have had a chance to gain on-battlefield experience, so this disadvantage may have lessened. Based off some of the Bradley's struggles in Iraq, Russia's best bet to destroy the M2A2 in Ukraine is to hit it with mines and RPG attacks. Such attacks worked best against the Bradley in Ukraine and in Iraq. Ukraine is unlikely to receive upgrades or new M2s at all for the foreseeable future as the US Congress remains bitterly divided. This means the Russians need to slowly dwindle away the Ukrainian Bradleys until they are too few in number to matter. This will require the Russian war and economic machine to stay steady at its current pace, but the Russian nation seems to have had no problems doing that throughout history, even at the cost of millions of their men. In a war of attrition, everything is a pure numbers game. So, some potential weaknesses of the M2A2 Bradley in Ukraine include vulnerability to large-caliber ammunition, crew inexperience, and cheap, highly explosive weapons. The American-made fighting vehicle may be formidable, but it certainly is not invincible. Generally, in the future I would expect war to become more about how costly weapons are and getting the most bang for your buck, quite literally. Nations will look to treat every engagement as an opportunity to weaken the other's economy, as a tank destroyed will mean another one that will have to be built. Cheap munitions that can do the most damage to the most things will become the goal of the battlefield. Ukraine doesn't even have the option to produce more tanks, but Russia does. In such a situation, Russia just slips into their default strategy of a war of attrition, and they will win unless Ukraine finds better strategies or gains more production. These were only my thoughts on the current state of things. Let me know what you guys thought of this video in the comments down below. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.